The scissors bit with a crunch that tore through the hush of the street, and the first lock of Leora's hair tumbled into the dust, dark and shining against the grit, while the crowd gasped as if a body had fallen. She sat rigid on the overturned crate they had forced her onto, her wrists tied with coarse rope, her jaw clenched tight, though her chest heaved with each ragged breath. Children pressed close, eyes wide with morbid delight, and mothers pulled them nearer instead of shielding them, whispering that this was what came of pride. The barber's hand shook as he cut, but the sheriff's glare burned into his back until he snipped again. Strands falling faster, a storm of shorn hair gathering at her feet. "Vanity stripped clean," Sheriff Hale barked, his voice thick with self-righteousness, "so the town may see her for what she is." Leora flinched as another lock yanked free, her scalp burning, tears stinging but unshed, for she would not give them that triumph. The people jeered. "She thought herself too fine. Let's see if she smiles now without her crown." A boy darted forward, snatching a strand from the ground, waving it like a trophy before dropping it in the dirt for boots to grind. Laughter exploded, cruel and eager, and the barber's hands grew bolder, chopping uneven, jagged chunks until her once long hair clung in ragged tufts to her head. Leora closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice telling her never to cut it, that each strand carried memory, that dignity was woven into it like thread. The memory twisted like a knife as she heard the drunkards shout from the saloon, "Cut it all! Leave her bare as shame itself!" The last length fell, hacked crude, scattering across the dirt road, and silence pressed for a moment, broken only by the sound of boots grinding the strands deeper into dust. Leora's head felt naked, the air raw against her scalp, and still she sat. Trembling but upright, her bound hands clenched into fists. The sheriff raised his voice again, pointing to the pile at her feet. "There lies her pride. Let the wind carry it. She has nothing left." The crowd laughed, but beneath it a murmur stirred, some uneasy, for her stillness beneath the jeers unsettled them more than tears would have. The barber stepped back, sweat on his brow, muttering that the work was done, and Sheriff Hale shoved Leora from the crate, forcing her to her knees in the pile of her own hair. Dust puffed around her, strands clinging to her skin, and the people hooted at the sight of her, bowed, though she bit her lip until it bled rather than cry. A stone skittered across the road, thrown by some boy emboldened by the crowd, and struck her shoulder, and she swayed but did not fall. Hale sneered, folding his arms, certain the humiliation was complete. But even as the crowd roared, a shadow shifted at the edge of the street, a tall figure pausing where the sunlight met the boardwalk, eyes fixed not on the sheriff nor the crowd, but on the hair scattered in the dust. He did not move yet, but the sight of him there sent a ripple through those who noticed, a weight heavier than the sheriff's voice. And though Leora could not see him through the blur of her lashes, her body felt the change in the air, as if the ground itself had chosen to witness what they had done. The crowd still howled, their jeers thick as dust in the air, when the tall stranger stepped forward at last, boots thudding on the boards before sinking into the street. He did not speak, did not spare the sheriff or the barber a glance. His gaze stayed fixed on the strands scattered at Leora's knees, glinting like black ribbon in the dirt. Murmurs rippled as he bent low, the sun catching his weathered face, his broad shoulders blocking the crowd's view of her for the first time. His calloused hands reached for the strands, gathering them one by one, brushing aside boots that had tried to grind them to powder. The people hissed with disbelief. "What's he doing?" "Leave it there, it's filth." But he ignored them, steady as if his task were sacred. Leora blinked through her haze, breath caught in her throat, for no one had lifted a hand for her, no one had spoken, But this stranger now knelt in the dust where she knelt, his fingers cradling the pieces of her shame as though they were worth gold. A woman in the crowd scoffed. He must be mad, touching what was cursed. Another laughed. Maybe he wants a keepsake of vanity. The sheriff's voice cut over them, sharp with fury. Get up, cowboy. That dirt isn't yours to clean! But the man did not move faster, nor slower, only continued, his rough palm sweeping every strand into his grasp with patience that made the jeers falter. Leora felt heat rush to her face. Not from shame this time, but from something she could not name. A tremor in her chest that steadied her against the rope biting her wrists. She whispered hoarsely, Why would you? But he gave no answer, only pressed the hair together gently, tucking loose strands into his hand as if gathering threads of a broken flag. The crowd pushed closer, angry at his silence, hungry to break the stillness he carried. And a boy tried to stomp near, but the cowboy's head snapped up, his eyes dark as storm clouds, and the boy stumbled back without a word. Gasps rolled through the people, unsettled by a calm fiercer than rage. Sheriff Hale stepped off the porch, hand resting on his revolver, jaw clenched tight. Last warning, stranger. Leave it in the dirt, or you'll lie there too. Leora shuddered, her body tense, her scalp burning with the phantom weight of what had been stolen. Yet she found herself leaning toward him, desperate that he not rise, desperate that he finish what he had begun. The cowboy's jaw flexed. But he did not lift his eyes from the strands he gathered. Slowly he stood, his height casting a long shadow over Leora, the cut hair clutched carefully against his chest. The street fell quiet, only the creak of wagons and the flap of a torn banner breaking the hush, for in his silence there was defiance greater than any shout. Leora's breath shook, her knees pressed hard into the dust, and the people leaned forward, waiting for the sheriff's gun to settle what pride could not. Sheriff Hale's spurs rang against the porch steps as he advanced into the dust, his hand heavy on the revolver at his hip, his eyes narrowed to slits beneath the brim of his hat. The crowd hushed, eager for blood, eager to see what this standoff would cost. Leora trembled on her knees, her scalp raw, the ragged tufts of her shorn hair catching the breeze, but her eyes clung to the cowboy standing tall beside her, the stolen strands pressed to his chest as though they were relics pulled from holy ground. Stranger, Hale barked, his voice carrying across the square, you've made a mistake stepping into this street. That filth you hold belongs to the gutter, and if you don't drop it now, I'll put you in the dirt beside it. A ripple of laughter surged from the saloon door, men shouting encouragement, women pressing closer, children craning necks to see. The cowboy finally lifted his gaze, calm and unhurried, his eyes dark and steady as a river that had never known drought. He didn't speak. Not yet. Only looked at the sheriff as though measuring a man already found wanting, and that silence rattled Hale worse than any curse. What's your name? The sheriff demanded, trying to seize back the moment. The man's voice came low, even, firm enough to cut the air without rising. Colt Mercer. The crowd muttered, some recognizing the name from whispers of cattle drives and fights won far from here, others spitting in disbelief that a drifter would dare defy the badge. Hale's lip curled. Then remember it when the ground takes you. Drop it. Colt's fingers flexed around the hair, his stance steady, his boots planted deep in the dust. No. The single word struck sharper than a whip, and gasps rose, women clutching their shawls, men growling that the stranger had signed his death. The sheriff's hand twitched on the revolver, but he did not draw, not yet. For the crowd's silence pressed heavy, and doubt prickled in the eyes of his deputies. Leora's breath caught, her wrists aching against the rope, for she had never heard a word sound so immovable, Never seen a man carry stillness like a shield. Hale snarled, stepping closer, his shadow cutting across Colt's face. You think one word makes you stronger than law? That hair is nothing, and the woman beneath it less than nothing. Leora's heart twisted, shame and rage burning her chest, but Colt's reply was calm as stone. If it was nothing, you wouldn't fear me holding it. The murmur surged again, sharper, and some heads turned. Some faces pale, for truth had a way of sounding like thunder when spoken plain. Hale's face purpled, sweat glistening on his brow, and he yanked the revolver from its holster at last, steel gleaming in the sun. Leora gasped, her cry lost in the roar of voices, and the crowd surged forward, torn between bloodlust and awe. The sheriff leveled the barrel at Colt's chest, the hammer cocked back, his finger tight on the trigger, and the square held its breath, waiting for the shot that would shatter everything. The square seemed to shrink around the two men, the sheriff's revolver fixed on Colt Mercer's chest, the air so taut that even the restless children clung to their mother's skirts in silence. Leora knelt in the dirt, strands of her shorn hair scattered around her like ashes, her breath ragged as she stared at the man who stood unflinching before death, the bundle of hair still clutched firm in his hand. Sheriff Hale's voice cracked the hush like a whip. "Drop it, Mercer, or I swear the dirt drinks your blood." The crowd murmured, some eager for the crack of gunfire, others shifting uneasily. For the sheriff's hand shook faintly, and the sweat at his temple betrayed fear more than fury. Colt's voice came low, steady, as if he spoke not to the man before him, but to the earth itself. "You can shoot me, Sheriff, but even if I fall, these won't scatter where you want them. They'll stay." He lifted the strands slightly, not in boast, but in quiet defiance, and a ripple of unease passed through the people, for his calm bent the threat into something smaller, something hollow. Hale snarled, jabbing the gun forward, but Colt did not flinch, his boots rooted as though the dust itself refused to let him be moved. Leora's eyes burned. Tears she had sworn not to shed stinging her lashes, for in that stillness she saw not pity, but a strength she had never been given, and it shook her more than the gun. From the saloon doorway a drunk barked, "Shoot him already!" And laughter followed, brittle, trying to mask the dread crawling over the crowd. The sheriff's jaw clenched, his finger tightening, when suddenly a voice rose sharp from the throng. "He won't shoot! He knows the crowd's seen too much!" All heads turned, murmurs swelling, and Hale's face reddened darker, fury at being exposed mixing with his fear. He swung the barrel towards the voice. But in that instant Colt stepped forward, closing the distance by a single pace, his shadow stretching over Leora as though to shield her. Gasps erupted, the crowd recoiling, for no one had dared step closer to the sheriff with a gun drawn. Colt's voice cut through the din, iron in its calm. "If law is shame and cruelty, then your badge is nothing but tin." The words struck deeper than steel, and some in the crowd nodded, whispers of agreement rising, the sheriff's authority crumbling under the weight of a stranger's truth. Hale's hand shook harder, the gun wavering, and sweat dripped from his temple, but still he barked, desperate. "One more step and I'll—" His threat broke off as Leora, trembling yet fierce, rose unsteadily to her feet, rope binding her wrists, her shorn head bare to the sun, and spoke hoarsely for all to hear. "Then shoot us both, but you'll never cut me smaller than I already am." The words hung like a bell toll across the square, silencing even the cruelest mouths, and for the first time the sheriff faltered, his gun wavering not from choice but from doubt. Sheriff Hale's hand trembled, the revolver wavering as murmurs surged like waves in the square, some faces pale, others hard with doubt, and he knew in that moment that silence would drown him if he did not seize back control. With a snarl he shoved the pistol back into its holster and barked to his deputies, Bring me a torch. If her pride won't burn from her head, we'll burn it from the ground." The words struck the crowd like a stone tossed into still water, and gasps broke into cruel laughter as one deputy rushed to the blacksmith's forge, snatching a brand that glowed orange at its tip. Leora staggered, her stomach lurching. For she understood before the crowd did. He meant to burn the hair Colt still held, to turn her last dignity into smoke. "No," she choked, stepping forward despite the rope binding her wrists, but her voice was drowned by the roar of approval as the torch was brought, its flame spitting sparks into the air. Hale jabbed a finger at Colt. "Drop it in the fire, Mercer, or you'll join her shame." The deputy thrust the torch close, heat licking the strands, and for the first time Colt's hand shifted, not to release, but to press the hair tighter against his chest, his eyes dark with something that made the deputies hesitate. "This doesn't belong to you," he said at last, his voice low but clear, carrying above the noise. "It doesn't belong to the gutter, or the fire, or your badge. It belongs to her, and it stays with us." The words rolled heavy through the square, stunning the laughter into silence, for their calm was fiercer than any shout. Leora's breath caught, her knees weak, her heart pounding, for no one had ever spoken for her, not once in her life, and now this man stood with her broken hair in his hands and declared it sacred. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, as if unsure whether they still wanted to mock what had been claimed with such steadiness. Hale's face darkened with rage, the torch shaking in his deputy's grip, and he spat. "You dare speak for her? You dare defy me before this town?" Colt did not move, did not flinch, his voice still steady as stone. "No, Sheriff, I don't speak for her. I speak against you." The hush deepened, the crowd no longer jeering but waiting, caught between the weight of authority and the power of truth. Hale, cornered by his own fury, ripped the torch from his deputy's hand and lunged, trying to press the flame to the bundle. Gasps erupted, a woman screamed, and Leora cried out in desperation, but Colt's free hand shot out, iron strong, catching Hale's wrist and holding it still, though the fire spat sparks inches from his chest. For a heartbeat they locked, lawman and stranger, the torch sputtering between them, the crowd frozen, the stench of singed hair rising faintly in the air. Then Hale roared, twisting, his face purple, his teeth bared, as the mob leaned forward, desperate to see who would yield first. The torch hissed and spat sparks as Sheriff Hale strained, his wrist locked in Colt Mercer's grip, their faces inches apart, the crowd roaring with each shift as though the struggle were a cockfight. The heat licked Colt's sleeve, smoke curling, but still he held fast, his arms steady as stone while Hale's face turned redder with effort. Leora's cry pierced the din, her bound hands tugging uselessly at the rope, terror tearing her throat raw, but Colt's gaze never wavered from the sheriff's eyes. With a grunt he twisted, wrenching the torch free, and in one swift motion he drove its burning tip into the dirt, grinding it out beneath his boot until the flame choked and died. Gasps rippled through the square, some voices rising in outrage, others in awe, and the silence that followed was heavier than the smoke that drifted upward. Hale staggered back, chest heaving, his badge glinting in the pale morning light, and his deputies hovered uncertain, unwilling to move against a man who had just snuffed their sheriff's fire with such calm finality. Colt bent, lifted the strands again, and held them close, the ash-stained ends trembling in his hand, but unburned. "Still whole," he murmured, not to the crowd, but to the woman who knelt. And Leora felt the words strike deeper than a hymn, steadier than prayer. The crowd murmured, shame creeping into some eyes, while others hissed louder, unwilling to let go of their cruelty. "He can't keep them," someone shouted. "Make her eat them." Laughter burst harsh and brittle, desperate to cover the unease that now ran through the square. Hale, humiliated, bellowed, "Seize him! He defies the badge!" But no man moved at once, for Colt's silence weighed heavier than the law. At last, 2 deputies lunged, but Colt stepped back, placing himself squarely before Leora, his hand brushing her shoulder for the first time. A shield as natural as breath. The deputies faltered, seeing not wild rage but a calm that promised violence only if forced. Leora lifted her head, her eyes burning, her scalp raw but her spine straighter than it had been since the first snip. "You've taken enough," she rasped, her voice hoarse but clear. The crowd stilled at her words, for defiance had been expected from a stranger, never from the woman they had cut. Hale's fury boiled over, and he drew his revolver again, the steel gleaming as he roared, "Then you'll both swing at dawn!" Gasps erupted, children whimpered, and whispers darted like sparks, some fearful, some thrilled. Colt's voice cut through, steady and low. "If you hang us for this, Sheriff, then the whole town will hang with us, for you saw what was done and you said nothing." His words struck like stones cast into a pond, ripples of guilt spreading fast, faces paling as truth clawed at their pride. Hale's hand shook, his finger tightening, but before he could fire, a stone clattered across the dirt, thrown not at Colt, but at Hale himself, striking his boot. The crowd gasped, heads snapping toward the place it had come from, and Hale's eyes widened with rage, for he understood in that instant that the people were beginning to turn. The stone striking Sheriff Hale's boot cracked the square open like thunder, and the uneasy hush that followed was louder than any jeer. Hale's face twisted with fury, his revolver jerking upward as he shouted, "Who dares?" But no one spoke. No one stepped forward, and in their silence lay the first splinter of rebellion. Leora swayed on her feet, her wrists raw from rope, her scalp burning where tufts of hair clung, but her eyes widened at the shift, at the way shoulders hunched and glances darted, as though guilt had finally pricked the mob's heart. Colt Mercer stood unmoved, the strands of her hair still gathered in his hand. The dust smudged dark on his palm, and his voice carried steady. "You've all seen enough. This was never about law. This was about pride and cruelty." Murmurs spread, some heads bowing, others snapping up in anger, and the crowd fractured before her eyes. A rancher barked, "The sheriff keeps us safe," while another man snarled back, "Safe from who? From girls he hates?" A woman clutched her child tight, her voice trembling. "It wasn't sickness, was it? He lied." The word lied carried fast, sharper than a lash, and suddenly tongues loosened, whispers swelling into shouts. Hale swung his revolver towards the crowd, desperation searing his face. "Quiet, all of you quiet, or I'll—" But his threat broke under the rising tide of voices, for authority built on fear withers once fear is gone. Leora's knees weakened, her breath shallow, but she found strength in the storm that no longer lashed only her. She lifted her chin, her voice hoarse but sharp. "You cut my hair to shame me, but look, he carries what you tried to trample." She turned her eyes on the crowd, and some shifted with shame, unable to meet her gaze. Hale's jaw clenched, veins bulging at his temple, and he roared, "Enough! Seize them both!" 2 deputies moved, but their steps were halting, their eyes flicking nervously at the townsfolk who no longer cheered them. Colt stepped forward, placing the strands carefully in Leora's bound hands, his voice firm enough to shake the dust. "It stays with us." Gasps rose, the words carrying like a bell toll, and something broke in the mob. A dozen faces flushed red, while others softened, torn between rage and reckoning. A young boy slipped free of his mother's grasp, darting into the street to kneel by the scattered strands Colt had not yet gathered. He picked one up, small and trembling, but instead of mocking, he pressed it into Leora's palm. The hush that followed burned hotter than Hale's fury, for the simple act weighed heavier than any speech. Hale's revolver snapped toward the child, and shrieks erupted, mothers clutching their young, men shouting, some surging forward. Colt's hand shot to his holster, eyes flashing, but he did not draw yet, holding that breathless space where blood could spill or mercy could reign. Hale's finger twitched on the trigger, the barrel gleaming in the sun, and the question trembled in the dust. Would he fire on his own town to keep his power, or would the town finally rise against him? The revolver glinted cruel in the sun as Sheriff Hale leveled it at the boy kneeling in the dust, the small strand of Leora's hair still trembling in his hand, and the square erupted in screams as mothers pulled their children close, fathers shouting in disbelief that the lawman would aim at one so small. The boy froze, wide-eyed, his breath quick and shallow, but his fingers clenched the strand tighter instead of dropping it, a defiance so pure it silenced the mob louder than any sermon. Hale's voice cracked, ragged with desperation. "Back away, boy! That filth curses all who touch it!" But the child shook his head, his thin voice breaking yet steady enough to pierce the crowd. "It's not filth, it's hers!" The words hung in the hot air like a bell toll, and gasps spread, some faces paling, others hardening, for the innocence of it stripped every excuse bare. Colt Mercer stepped forward, his hand brushing his holster, his eyes dark and unblinking, his voice carrying iron calm. "Put the gun down, Sheriff. Even you won't come back from this." The deputies faltered, exchanging looks, unease gnawing, for even those loyal to Hale knew no badge could shield a man who shot a child in daylight. Hale's jaw clenched, his hand trembling. Sweat dripping into his collar, but pride roared louder than sense, and he barked, "He's tainted! Like her! I'll cleanse this town!" A ripple of fury surged through the crowd, a woman's scream breaking first, then a man's shout, "You'd kill a boy for her hair?" The mob pressed forward, anger swelling, fear breaking like glass, and suddenly the sheriff's authority wavered on a blade's edge. Leora swayed, her wrists raw, her body weak, but fire burned in her eyes as she called hoarsely, "If you kill him, Hale, then you prove I was never unclean. You were." The shout struck like lightning, and murmurs turned to cries, the crowd's voices rising against the sheriff who had branded them all with his spite. Hale roared, shoving his finger tighter on the trigger, but Colt moved faster, stepping between boy and gun, his shoulders broad, his chest rising steady as stone. His voice came low but clear, every word cutting the noise. "If you fire now, Sheriff, you'll fire into me, and you'll learn who this town fears more." Gasps tore through the crowd, and in the hush that followed, even the boy's small breaths seemed thunderous. Hale's eyes flickered, his hand shaking, his authority slipping with every heartbeat as the people edged closer. Their fury a tide threatening to drown him. The sheriff's lips curled in a snarl, veins bulging at his temple, and with a ragged roar he ripped his aim upward, firing into the sky, the shot cracking like the heavens splitting. Birds burst from the rooftops, wings scattering, the acrid smoke curling above the square, and the crowd surged, no longer cowed but emboldened, their anger unchained. Hale's gun wavered, the crowd closing, Colt unmoving, and the town itself seemed to decide in that instant whether to topple its own law. The gunshot still echoed when the crowd surged like floodwater breaking a dam, men and women shoving forward, shouting over one another, their fear burned away by fury. No longer jeers, no longer whispers. This was rage unchained, and its force shook the square. Sheriff Hale stumbled back, his revolver shaking in his hand, his eyes wide as faces that once bowed now bore down with hate. "Seize him!" he screamed, pointing at Colt Mercer, desperate to turn wrath away from himself, but not a single hand moved, not a single man obeyed. Instead, Voices rose from every corner. He branded her for spite. He aimed at a child. He's no sheriff. He's a tyrant. Hale's deputies faltered, their boots dragging in the dust, torn between duty and the mob that no longer stood behind the badge. Colt stayed steady at the center, his body a wall between Leora, the boy, and the fury boiling around them, the strands of hair still cradled in his hand. His calm was a weight heavier than violence, holding the storm at bay, but Hale could not see it, would not admit it. With a roar, he lunged, grabbing at the strands, his fingers clawing, desperate to destroy the proof of his cruelty. Colt's arm swung, knocking him aside, but Hale stumbled back only to charge again, froth at his lips, his mind shattered by humiliation. The crowd roared louder, some crying for his badge, others calling for his blood, the square trembling beneath their boots. Leora swayed but did not fall, her wrists bleeding against the rope, her eyes burning as she shouted, "You cut me down to break me, Hale, but you broke yourself." Her voice struck the mob like a match to tinder, and they surged closer, fists raised, ready to tear him apart. Desperation twisted Hale's face as he drew a knife from his belt, its blade gleaming in the sunlight, his last weapon San Mardo, his last chance to reclaim control. "If I can't burn her shame," he bellowed, spittle flying, "I'll carve it from her myself." The mob shrieked, horror and fury clashing as he lunged towards Leora, knife aimed high. Colt dropped the strands into her bound hands, stepping forward to meet him, his shoulders squared, his eyes dark with final resolve. The two men collided at the base of the porch, the knife slashing wild, Colt's hand snapping to Hale's wrist, locking it tight. The struggle bent them both, dust rising in a choking cloud, the mob pressing so close the air seemed to vanish. Gasps tore through the square, women screaming, men shouting as the knife trembled inches from Colt's throat. Hale's face twisted in rage, his arms straining with every ounce of hate left in him. For the first time, Colt grunted, his calm cracking into raw strength, and the sound drove the crowd into silence, all eyes fixed on the knife that hovered, glinting, a breath away from spilling blood. The knife trembled in the narrow space between breath and blood, Sheriff Hale snarling like a cornered beast, Colt Mercer's arm locked tight on his wrist, the dust spinning around them as the crowd held its breath. With a roar, Hale shoved, the blade slicing close enough to graze Colt's jaw, but the cowboy's other hand shot up, clamping the sheriff's throat, forcing him back step by step. The mob surged, their fury spilling into cries, but no one dared step between, for this was the ending they had demanded, lawman and stranger locked where truth had cornered lies. With one final wrench, Colt twisted. The knife wrenched free and flung into the dirt, steel clattering harmless among the boots of men who no longer believed in the hand that had wielded it. Hale fell to his knees, coughing, spitting dust, his badge glinting dull as tarnished tin, and the roar that rose from the crowd was not applause but condemnation. "Out with him," someone shouted, and another bellowed, "He's no sheriff." The tide pressed closer, but Colt lifted a hand, his calm stilling them, and for the first time the mob obeyed not fear, not fury, but respect. He turned, his chest rising hard, his sleeve scorched from the torch, his jaw bleeding from the graze, and found Leora trembling, the strands of her hair still clutched in her bound hands. Slowly, he bent, his fingers brushing hers, gathering every fallen piece from the dust until none remained at their feet. Kneeling before her, he untied the rope with hands steady as stone, and when her wrists came free, she gasped, clutching the bundle to her chest as if it were life itself. Colt's voice came low but firm, carrying to every ear in the square. "They tried to scatter you. They tried to burn you, but it stays with us." The words rippled outward, sinking deeper than any bullet, silencing the last jeer, bowing the last head. Tears blurred Leora's eyes, not from shame, but from a weight lifted, and she pressed the strands to her heart, each lock no longer a relic of humiliation, but a thread of survival, woven into something no crowd could steal. The townsfolk shifted, some pale with guilt, others ashamed, a few bowing their heads as though in prayer, for they knew the truth, that cruelty had been theirs as much as the sheriff's. Hale staggered to his feet, but no hand reached to steady him. No voice rose to defend him. His badge gleamed once in the light before he ripped it free, hurling it into the dust, and stumbled into the alleys like a ghost already forgotten. Silence followed, heavy, the kind that comes when shame hangs thicker than smoke. Colt rose, offering his hand not as savior but as equal, and Leora, hair ragged, scalp raw, dignity battered but unbroken, took it. He walked her across the square, past the porch where she had been shorn, past the ashes of the torch, past the place where the sheriff had fallen. Each step pressed her stolen strands tighter against her chest, each step a vow that they belonged not to dust nor jeer, but to her and to the man who had seen worth in what the world had tried to trample. At the edge of the street, with the dawn pouring gold over them, Colt touched the bundle once more, steadying her hands, his eyes unflinching. "Carry them," he murmured. "They're yours. Always." And together they stepped into the morning, leaving behind a town that would never forget the day its cruelty was gathered from the dirt and placed back into the arms of the woman it had tried to break. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had seen her hair fall into the dirt, would you have bent down to gather it too?